Welcome back to Art 127 Watercolor. For this lesson, we're going to be discussing a new technique I call puddle painting, and we'll also reinforce two pigment properties we've already talked about a little bit. We'll go more into depth with them this lesson. These are the topics we're going to cover in this lesson. So we're going to discuss watercolor transparency. We're going to discuss the staining quality of watercolor. We're going to introduce a new painting surface, which is hot press paper. We have a new painting technique or method, a significant departure from where we've been up to now. I call it puddle painting, but essentially what we're doing is we're going wet into wet in sections on hot press paper. And we're going to reinforce our color harmony schemes that we've already discussed. Let's go back and review pigment properties. I keep hitting on this. I want you to all to understand them by the end of the semester. So hue is the color name. Value we discussed in assignment 2. Temperature we discussed in assignment 3, as well as intensity. And now we've discussed transparency a little bit as it applies to white paint. So now we're going to discuss a different range of pigments from transparent to opaque. And we're also going to discuss the staining quality of our pigments. If you look at this chart over here, this is why we have a black line test to discuss the staining quality. I'll go into that more in depth in a moment. And then finally, granulation we have touched on, but we're going to discuss it in depth in the next lesson for texture. There's another quality of pigment I haven't touched on too much, and that's whether or not a pigment is permanent. Some pigments have a reputation for being fugitive, we call it, which means they'll fade under the light. So you do want to, if you're going to ever paint paintings for sale, you'll want to be aware of this quality of the pigment as well. One of the more prominently known fugitive pigments is this opera pink or alizarin crimson without the permanent. So you want to be careful about using those pigments, or at least treat your painting for light fastness if you want to use those pigments. Alright, let's talk about watercolor transparency then. Let's just talk about this up here. So we have a black line that we've painted over the top of. I've had you do that in several assignments before. So now we're going to say why we're painting over the top of it. So let's just look at the two reds for a minute. And if you look where the paint is painted over this quinacridone rose color, we can really see that black line. It looks like there's no paint there at all. Compared to this pigment, which we can see the paint on top of the back line. So we call this pigment, this is a Daniel Smith pigment, and they give a rating of just 3 qualities. Either it's transparent, or it's semi-transparent, or it's opaque. So this one isn't quite opaque. It doesn't cover up the black line completely like a white would, but it's considered semi-transparent. So then again, you look at the oranges, and these two are about the same. This one's a little more transparent than this one. So I'm using the chart here, but I'm also looking at the manufacturer's guide. I would say that the transparent nature of watercolor is its most significant pigment quality. All watercolor pigments are transparent to some degree compared to, say, the opacity of oil painting or acrylic painting. But transparency in watercolor is what it's known for. So you're asking yourself, is it see-through, or is it opaque, or is it somewhere in between? So that's what we're talking about now, and then this black line test is how we tell. You can also use the manufacturer's guide. Each major manufacturer like Daniel Smith or Holbein or Winsor Newton will have a guide that'll kind of tell you. And usually you can do an internet search in order to find that out. but I like to use the manufacturer's guide plus my tests and come up with my conclusions. So on the yellows, I'm using on this chart Hansa Yellow Deep, but there's another yellow that's very much the same color called New Gamboge, and that pigment is really transparent. And Hansa Yellow Deep is a little more semi-transparent according to the manufacturer's guide, but you can see between these two yellows there is a difference, right? So it's not as sensitive of a guess. Another manufacturer might call this one semi-transparent and this one semi-opaque, because you can see the line. And in the blues, almost all the regular pigments that we would use are like ultramarine blue. I didn't have that labeled here for some reason, but this is ultramarine blue by Holbein, and that's a very transparent pigment. And so is phthalo blue. That's considered a very transparent, it's probably one of our most transparent pigments. And these both are transparent pigments. So most of the pigments that I use tend to be transparent. This one, this red, Pyrrole Scarlet tend to be semi-opaque, I think. They're even more than semi-transparent. And this yellow, a lot of times the high-value yellow in most brands is opaque or semi-opaque pigment. So it's important to know that, because you can cover up things with an opaque pigment where you can't with a transparent pigment. But they also, not always, but most opaque pigments also tend to be easier to lift, which is our next quality we'll talk about. So on your assignment, you're going to indicate with either a circle that doesn't have any lines in it, or a semicircle that's half filled in, or with a fully filled in circle. So if you chart your white, you want to fill in the circle with black the whole way. If you're using a different brand and your manufacturer's brand has another quality, either semi-transparent and semi-opaque, you want to put a circle with just a line through it to indicate semi-transparency. A little bit more about watercolor transparency. If you think of it like glass or colored stained glass, that helps you to understand what the transparency is all about. You're going to be layering colors, and you can see through each layer in order to see what's underneath. So some very common transparent pigments are phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, almost all the quinacridones. Anything that says crimson in the name, and New Gamboge, those are a lot of the transparent pigments. And I don't know what complements you're using, but those typically with those hue names, those will be transparent pigments. Some semi-transparent or semi-opaque pigments tend to be cobalt blue, cerulean, Hansa yellow, either medium, deep, or light, Pyrrole red, Pyrrole scarlet, the Cads, lemon yellow, etc. In Daniel Smith brand, specifically lemon yellow is a very transparent color. Some pigment manufacturers, as I was saying, also have a semi-opaque category or rating in addition to semi-transparent. So I know that the core colors indicate whether they're semi-transparent or semi-opaque, which is just a little bit more sensitive of a rating. And I would agree that sometimes some of the Daniel Smith pigments, for instance, that are rated as semi-transparent, I would consider them semi-opaque. And then our opaque pigments, the typical ones we like to use: whites, any gouache is a opaque pigment, Naples yellow, buff titanium, wisteria, lavender, horizon blue, Indian red. Those are pretty common hue names. Gouache is a whole range of colors that you can get. Usually it's designer's gouache, which some people consider it not a professional paint, that's archival. But gouache, I believe they add chalk to the pigment in order to make it opaque, but all gouache is opaque. And all our white pigments are at least semi-opaque, if not completely opaque. All right, let's talk about the next pigment quality, and its staining quality. So the test is, does it lift easily or does it stain the paper? So some of our easily lifting are cobalt, cerulean, ultramarine. Those are our good blues. and yellow ochre. Those tend to be lifting pigments, and some natural pigments. Some of the most notorious stainers are the phthalos, the cadmiums, and a lot of the quinacridones. I didn't list those here. And most yellows tend to stain rather than lift. So here's a color wheel where I've done the actual test. So the way you do the test, and I like to do it kind of next to the black line, but you put water down and then you let it sit for a minute and soak in, and then you take your brush and you lift off and then wipe it off on your towel, and then lift again and wipe it off on your towel. Every time you try to lift the pigment, remember to wipe it off on your towel or your sponge so that you're not putting the pigment right back down. So I put the water down, let it cook. We look here, and immediately I see this one's really close to the white of the paper, and this one hardly anything lifts. So this is the phthalo, and this is the ultramarine light by Holbein, and this is the phthalo blue by Daniel Smith. You can see it's very staining. You can't get very much of the paint off at all. Another really staining one is this Puddle red. You may have Puddle scarlet if you bought the little kit. That one is also very staining. This orange, this yellow says it's Hansa yellow light. Looks like it lifts a little bit, but most yellows tend to stain in my experience. So do that test, compare it with the manufacturer's guide as well. For the technique that we're going to use, the puddle painting technique, we're going to use a different kind of paper. We've been using cold press for the most part for the whole course. Now we're going to introduce the hot press. So you can see from this picture it's a slicker surface, and I find it to be ideal for puddle painting, especially if you buy the Arch brand that has external sizing as well as internal sizing. I find the water will sit up on the paper nicer. You have a little more time to swirl in your paint. And we've talked about cold press and rough. Those are the other surfaces. We're going to get into the rough paper in the next assignment, but we've been mostly using cold press so far. So the watercolor technique that I mentioned is wet into wet in sections on hot press paper. So that's a lot of words. So I came up with a way to name it as puddle painting. Now you probably won't find this in a book unless I write it. Essentially, I like to paint by creating a puddle and then dropping the color in the puddle and letting all the colors mix on the paper. There's a wonderful artist I know named Bev Joswick. She lives in Washington, and she paints exclusively on hot press watercolor paper. And similarly, she lets all the colors just blend and bleed onto the paper, and you get a real nice color vibrancy. So I call it the perfect marriage of color. So you put it on the paper and let it mix. You see all the colors, but when you put them all together, they combine. They read as black, but you get to see the individuality of the colors as well. So I would encourage you to look at Bev Joswick. This links to her website. Just follow her painting. She's a really wonderful watercolor painter. And this is my work. I like to paint on hot press paper. It's a little more uncommon surface. This is one of my newer ones. You can puddle in with paint and then add the color, but again, I love to see the color mixing on the paper. So we'll do that technique. You'll have a video to watch on the technique. So as I said, you create a puddle of water or paint and then swirl more color into the puddle and let it blend and bleed, very much like it has, I think, a very stained glass quality when you're done. Now you're going to be able to use either analogous or triadic color harmony. It's your choice. These are two that we've already discussed, but you'll need to use at least 3 pigments, and you'll want to indicate what your color harmony choice is in either a text or give me a color wheel some way to indicate it. I want to know that you know which color harmony you're using. Remember, triadic color harmony is just picking 3 colors that are equally spaced around the color wheel. And the analogous color, they just need to be adjacent on the color wheel. You need to do at least 3 colors. You can do more than that if you want to, but you need to indicate to me which pigments you're using. That's fresh out of the tube pigments and which ones you're mixing. Here's some student examples. So since we're painting in sections, some students like to mask off the lines with masking fluid so that the paint won't bleed into another section, and that's what effect this is. Another thing you can do, and which is what is in your video, is you can paint in sections and drop in the color, and then afterwards use an ink pen to find the lines to give it more of a stained glass quality. But I like, you get this marbly effect, and so it's fun to sometimes either do more of a mosaic where you save the white by masking or painting around it, or use the ink for looking like the lead in a stained glass painting. So those are just two nice student examples that I enjoyed from a previous class. So in summary then, for this lesson on puddle painting, we're discussing two new pigment properties, transparency and staining quality. We touched on it previously. Now we're going to go in and chart it more in depth. And then we're bringing in a new paper, which was the hot press, the real slick surface. We have a new technique that I call puddle painting, which is wet in sections on hot press paper. And we've reinforcing the two color harmonies, analogous color harmony and triadic color harmony, that we've discussed before. So the next lesson, this will be the final regular lesson of the term. We're going to be creating a lot of texture. We're going to do texture charts and then create a textured master copy painting. Tends to be one of our previous classes' favorite lessons, so I save it for last. Save the best for last. That's it for this lesson on puddle painting and transparency and staining quality of watercolor. Feel free to ask questions after you have watched the video lectures and read all the directions. Good luck and good painting.